in. So last week we finished the section on social justice and social sanctification. It really was interesting to kind of take those 4 questions and just see how God's doing a unique thing through this. I have to admit that I knew that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount was based on the 10 Commandments, and I always said that they were an expanding of the 10 Commandments. But as we've been studying the law, I don't think he expanded anything. He was just calling us back to the reality of what he first gave us. And I think all of this really is calling us back to what was meant to be in the garden before sin entered. And so we're finishing that section, but we're moving into, well, it's kind of disappointing Krista isn't here, because we're moving into the feast and festival section. It's party time. Woohoo! So we are ready for Exodus 23, and we're going to begin with verse 10. And my first paragraph is just 2 verses, so 10 and 11. All right, let's see what it says. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. So what do you think?
When's the last time that's been?
They let fields rest only by rotating crops on them, I guess. Kind of my thought.
We know.
A lot of people don't.
Yeah.
Well, they used to have soil banks, but the government paid them to not.
Right.
You don't even see that.
You don't see that much, so it must not, what the government was willing to pay to let it go fallow must not have been nearly worth what they got from the yields.
Once in a while around, when you see a harvest, you'll see the farmer has left maybe a couple of rows of corn or something for the deer. Especially around like reservoirs and things like that, for there's quite a few.
Yeah, I know, when we lived over in Huntington County, there around the Salamone Reservoir, there was always a strip of corn that they would plant and never harvest. But when was the last time that we saw, just as a general rule, that the population, one, either didn't even plant the field, but 2, would just allow anyone and everyone who came along to harvest from it?
Want your apples off your tree. Let me come and walk over there and get them.
In principle, we are kind of living into this with the garden, kind of. But we're not letting the ground go fallow. We're planting it for the sake of those who are less fortunate. But of course, by the same token, I think there's always those fields out there when you drive by and it's planted in beans and you see the like 3 dozen stalks of corn growing up in it. There's that kind of principle, but
Years ago, they used to rotate corn, beans, wheat, maybe some alfalfa, but every so often they did let it go. You don't see that much anymore, can you?
no, I mean, I remember as a kid down where we grew up in the White River Valley, you would see them leave fields fallow every so often, but I don't think it was once every 7 years. It might be once every 10 to 15 years, but not once every 7.
It didn't have the fertilizers and things that they put on it now. They grow crops every year, grow a good crop.
And I was thinking of that as I was reading this. Yeah, they didn't have those fertilizers and things, and yes, we do, and it's proving to have good yield. But what are we doing to the ground?
And the other thing is genetics.
Oh yeah, most are genetically modified.
Everything.
But I know in the last 10 years, in seeds in particular, they've started to stress, or maybe they're marketing heirloom crops, the non-genetically modified, the old varieties, even the tomato that's like this, that you can't hardly slice the thing.
Organic.
Fully organic. So who's this law protecting?
The environment.
The environment.
And when you protect the environment, it makes a better crop next year for the people.
Yeah. I can't help but think when we talk about protecting the environment, you know, every Sunday Mac makes a statement, it's a great day to be alive. I told that story my first Sunday here. The guy who always said that at my home church, he was a conservationist. And he talked about growing up in the Dust Bowl era and how we ruined things, and it took years before it ever kind of came back. And he actually was one of the few people I knew who he let his fields go fallow. He said it was a biblical principle. We saw what overcropping it did, and he wanted to do something different. But
You know, some farmers don't let their whole farm go fallow in the same year. They rotate parts of it.
Right.
What is that? Something coming up?
yeah, but so then that caused me to think of the second question. What's the principle here? What's God trying to do with this? I mean, think about what you have to do in order to let all fields go fallow. How much trust do you have to have that God's going to provide? I mean, we claim we trust God.
We don't even do 6 days of work, 1 day of rest.
Same thing with the day of rest. How many of us do that?
We really struggle with just taking the 1 day off, let alone taking a whole year off. Hey, Chris, you get 1 year off every 6 because no one's doing anything. There's no taxes to file.
It takes you the next 6 years to catch up from that year.
I grew up, my father never farmed. Absolutely did not turn a tractor on or anything. It just, that was his belief. Now, he also was a man that did not go to church with mother and the 7 kids. He was out walking his fields and thinking, and he said he was doing his prayer by himself.
I know I first heard the phrase when we were in Huntington County with all the farmers in that church, that you farm on Sunday, you're broke on Monday. And I think that's a bad motivation to not farm on Sunday. So realistically, I think the principle is, do we really trust God? I mean, now, don't get me wrong. Remember, this is being given to the people of Israel before they ever enter the promised land. In some ways, isn't this an extension of what God taught them with the manna? Grab the manna for 6 days. On the 6th day, you take double, and trust me, you'll have what you need on the 7th. So in some ways, God is multiplying that principle he taught them earlier with this, right? Yeah.
With that same idea, there's that idea of also preparation. God taught them, was teaching them, yes, trust me, but also teaching them, you're going to have to prepare, like getting the double the amount the day before of the manna. They're going to have to do some little extra work that year ahead of time, but they're also going to have a year of rest.
I'm gonna jump ahead to the next question. Is that
Okay, go right ahead.
My mind's been, so does it apply today? Like, he's still talking about fertilizers and things we have today, and I'm thinking about like ancestors that might have done things in the fall, knowing, you know, that they have to get food through the winter and they don't have as much gain out thing. But some of that doesn't apply today because of technology.
So I'm gonna push back because I'm wondering, doesn't it apply more? Because with our technology, we are falling away from this notion of take a day off, because the Sabbath was so that we remembered our value is found in our relationship to God, not in what we produce. And with technology now, we can force the ground to produce more than what it naturally should. And in some ways, what do you call it when you make a person do more than what they should? Slavery? I wasn't going that far with it, but I was thinking, isn't that abuse? Cruelty to animals, we talk about that. Could it be that we're allowing our technology to make us cruel to the environment? I'm feeling convicted as I say this because, you know,
How many animals were we killing?
well, we slaughter a whole lot of animals just for food.
It's the way we're raising crops.
You know, I remember when I was in high school in the late 90s, and they talked about how much of the Amazon rainforest was being leveled to create farm ground. And all the animals, and it's literally species that were disappearing that we don't even have an opportunity to know about because we're just taking them out before we can even discover them. And I think there's a part of me that really wonders, well, yes, we've learned to maximize things. Is that necessarily good? I think there's some aspects of it that are really good. That we've learned how to better care for plants and give them what they need. And that part is healthy and good. But I can't help but think that this produce and overproduce and double crop and at what point in time will that backfire on us? And maybe it won't.
Maybe some of that already is, because look at some of the health issues we have now that are probably related to
So,
the chemicals and things we put in to make food last longer.
right, so the chemical preservation, you know, there's questions about the genetically modified foods, whether or not those really are as healthy for us as we think. You know,
We have the Roundup situation too now.
but yes, that known, they're now starting to admit that just that chemical there, Roundup, has been linked with lots of different cancers. You know, I try not to be the conspiracy theorist, but I remember watching a documentary on shortening. That when it was first created, they were trying to create a substitute that could be used for butter, but animals wouldn't touch it. And they now use it in like artificial suet cakes for birds, but the birds just eat the seeds and fleck off all that. And I feel really bad even mentioning that because we've got a major factory for artificial oils right here in town and employs all kinds of people. But yet we're finding out that product, while it's cheap, and in some ways it helps people, in other ways, what's it doing to us long term? Maybe I should just stop. Maybe we should create a new container for stuff that we know we should talk about, but we just don't want to deal with.
You know, back in the 50s, there were some companies that had a waste product that was toxic, and they were trying to figure out how to get rid of it. So they started doing some studies, and they found out that if they put fluoride in the toothpaste, it prevented cavities. But it was toxic in larger quantities. Chlorine, they're all the same type of category.
Cleaning substances, but use it in the right way, it helps your teeth.
So you couldn't get rid of it illegally, so you gave it fed it to us.
What were you gonna say, Terry?
Well, I just think that, we're passing it on down to our children, the grandchildren. I don't think we're even paying attention to it right now.
And
It's like it's not gonna affect us, why worry about it?
And the interesting thing about that, bringing it back to our passage, is God knows that when he brings them to the land the first time, they're going to say no. And they're going to wander in the desert for 40 years. But he gives them this principle now, some 40 years before they're ever able to enact it. And I wonder how much we have that same thing where we know this, but the effects of not doing it take generations. Okay, let's see what the next one says. Maybe it'll make it any better. Probably not. 12. 6 days you shall work, do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman, and the alien may be refreshed. So you're already making the connection before we got there. But notice what's the implications of it this time. It's not just about you and how you identify. It's not just about what you produce, but it's about your whole family and all your employees and your animals. Everything within your household. There's a sense in which I think in our culture, we're okay with thinking of, we kind of jokingly talk about pets, dogs and cats as being part of the family. Larry, do you feel like your horses are part of the family?
No. That's not. No, you gotta go out with 0 and 10 below, and you gotta go out and bust ice. Bust the ice.
I just feel like work, huh?
Yeah, that's not real.
You do that on Sunday too?
Only if the horses want to drink.
I wonder how different things would be if we really truly began to see all of creation as our family.
You know, back when I was growing up, we had the blue laws here in Indiana. And therefore.
Blue laws. You familiar with the term blue law? Blue laws were essentially the notion that no business could operate on Sunday.
Oh, okay.
It's a whole principle. And unfortunately, it became synonymous with the notion of religious objectification, that Christianity forced the non-Christians to do this. And I don't know if there is any state that now still has blue laws on the books.
But you know what happened because of that? Families always did something together on Sundays.
You found when you stop, you find a different way of relating. And I think it's interesting that before they ever get into the promised land, God's trying to say, incorporate this into your rhythm now. Incorporate this into your identity now before you get into the work and you forget or don't take the time to make this a part of it. Because it's not just about you resting. It's about your servants being refreshed. It's about your animals being refreshed. It's about the ground, the earth being refreshed. We are all a part of this creation of God. Yes, humanity is the crown of creation. But in some ways, we're no better than the rest of creation. And in fact, going back to Genesis, the rest of creation suffers because of us. Isn't that what the story says?
Yeah, the snake has to live on the ground.
It lives on the ground produces thorns and briars because of us. Crops are not what they were before because of us.
Communication isn't what it was.
Communication isn't what it was. The animals used to be at peace with each other, and now there's the violence of the animal kingdom. Prey and predator, absolutely.
Is it true that the Jewish people do not cook on their Sabbath?
Correct.
And that's still true.
Yep.
Pilgrim Holiness does it too.
Yeah, a lot of the Pilgrim Holiness Christians still do follow that. You can stick something in the crock pot just so long as you're not actually cooking it the next day, but
That you get it ready on Friday.
yeah, they get it ready. You gotta get it ready on Friday before sundown.
Going back to the manna principle. Going back to manna principle.
Right. It really is going back to that manna principle. I will provide for you if you trust me with the rest. And both meanings of the rest. The rest of your body, the rest of your workers, but also the rest of your need.
So really, on Sunday, we shouldn't go out to eat or get groceries, because we're forcing other people to work.
That's the way my mother feels.
So we can.
Okay.
I
So-
didn't hear what Chris said.
She said, so realistically, we shouldn't go out to eat on Sundays as we're causing other people to
Or
work.
get groceries.
Or get groceries, or get gas, or whatever.
In other words, all businesses be closed.
So Charles and I have had this conversation, and I'll just be honest. Whether it's the United Methodist Church or the Global Methodist Church, both of them say that we are to live into John Wesley's rules for society. One of them is, the second one is it's do no harm, right? That talks about this. And it says in the principle of do no harm, we should keep the Sabbath. Do no regular work, nor cause anyone else to do work when you are in Sabbath. And the only way that we've come to agree on how this works is we both have said, Paul is right. Paul says that whether you celebrate the Sabbath or the Lord's Day or some other day, it doesn't matter which day you choose, for all days are equally holy. But when you practice Sabbath, not if, when you practice Sabbath, your Sabbath should be in such a way that you cause no one else to have to work because you are on the Sabbath. So if you're using Sunday as your Sabbath, then yes, in principle, you should not do anything on that day that causes someone else to work for your convenience. Unless it's absolutely necessary.
But if that other person that's working has a different day as a Sabbath,
For me, the only day that works, and I'll be honest, it doesn't work well, but the only day that really works for me to take a Sabbath is Friday. And I try very hard, I fail most of the time, but I try very hard to make from about 9 o'clock Thursday night, once we get done with Bible study and I get the video uploaded to YouTube, until about sunset Friday night as my Sabbath. And I try to take that day and I try to spend that with family. I try to spend it with God. I try to spend that not doing church work. And I genuinely try to make it to where I'm not making anybody else work. Now, because of the rhythms of our society, Friday night is a good night to go out and things like that. So, what we got? Amy. That could also be up to us to help you keep your Friday Sabbath. Well, there is that. After dark.
Which now it's like,
Yeah.
Well, Melissa and I always said I tried to keep it to about 6:30, 7 o'clock, somewhere in there. I tried to keep my Sabbath from, it's not quite a full 24 hours, but that's what I try to do. But you have to determine what works for you, what God is calling you to do. If Sunday is your Sabbath, then yeah, make that your, you talk about, especially in tax season, you try to take Sunday off. And if you can do Sunday, you do it. And you try to also still take Saturday or Thursday night, and I appreciate that. But, whatever your Sabbath is, I know the shop's closed on Monday for you guys. So Sunday and Monday, somewhere in there makes the most sense for you guys and what your Sabbath is. Each person, you have to decide within your family how you are going to honor God and take that time off. And for you, you should do your best to make sure that you're not forcing someone else to work for you so that you can have that Sabbath. I think that's how we keep it in the blue laws are gone. We can't change that within our society. I don't see any way that we could legislate having the whole country shut down on Sunday. But we can apply this to our own lives and make a decision within ourselves as to what that is.
Well, let me throw a little narrative at you.
Go for it.
Those of us who work in the healthcare field, illness does not take a day off.
Nope.
I think it forces to plan better. Back to when we knew things weren't gonna be open.
I think that that's part of the principle here. We've already kind of alluded to that with both the manna and with the field, right? If you know that you're taking this off, if you know you're letting this go, you have to plan better in the other 6 days so that you can do that. And yes, you're right. In the healthcare industry, there is no day where there's no one who gets sick. There is no day where no one gets injured. And for our police officers or firefighters, there is no day where nothing goes wrong. And maybe because of your work life, it can't be the same day every week. But again, that doesn't mean that we can't be intentional and say, I'm going to take what I can take and make it Sabbath. Does that make sense? And we're doing that, the principle behind it, we're doing that because we understand we are not defined. Our value, our worth is not defined by what we do, by what we produce, by what we make our machines and our animals and the ground do for us.
maybe if more people intentionally did that, we would have mentally and physically healthier version of ourselves.
Imagine that maybe God's principles might help us deal with things like anxiety. If you had 1 day out of 7 where you just knew you didn't have to worry about it, could that change things? Maybe.
I can remember back, I'm gonna say mid-70s when there was a gas shortage. And gas stations weren't open on Sunday. So a lot of people didn't do anything on Sunday because they couldn't go anywhere. That's about the only thing I can ever remember that kept us from doing anything on.
Ironically, you know what happened when that happened, right?
Yes, there goes that.
I was going to say there was a whole lot more births. As someone who was born in 1979. But think about the other implications of that. If you knew that you were going to do this and you had no other choice but to be around family, do you think we would learn how to get along better. You know, I mean, there's just all kinds of implications from this principle, right?
I can remember the lines on Saturday, all the way down 13th Street, all the way down 25th.
Yeah, they used to sell gas way back.
So, but this really only has to do with just taking Sundays off, right? That's all it's really about, right?
As somebody who's had employers say they wanted you to work 7 days a week. You know, if you knew, when you knew for sure your boss was going to give you time off, that you weren't going to have to work all the time or work yourself to death, you felt better about it. But when your boss tried to make you feel guilty about not being there all the time, you just didn't have any loyalty. You really didn't give a care. You got your paycheck, you got out of there. And if the place burned down while you're gone, hey, I hope my buddies got out.
Are you saying if employers use these principles, they might have better employees?
If you take one day off as a Sabbath, you work 6 days. Usually the day you have off, you spend doing all kind of work around the house, your lawn and all that stuff. Otherwise, that doesn't get done.
I know, I'm not saying we should do this, but I know that there are a number of countries in Europe that have started experimenting with a 4-day work week. And they've actually found that they're getting as much production as they were with the 5-day work week. And in many ways, the mental health issues are going down, the health issues are going down. And so you know, God isn't real and this book is old and antiquated, right? But maybe there's something behind it.
To shoot back at Jim though, is that because we plan that we're going to work on that day off? Where otherwise we might actually plan to do that work earlier in the week if we knew we couldn't do it or wouldn't do it on that day?
So how many hours you have to work? Some 8 hours, you get some time off, but some places are requiring 10 and 12.
And that goes back to the idea of how employers are treating their employees. And we can't change them, but we can change us, which I think is all the point. We need to make sure that we as Christians do that.
I think you're missing the point there, Chris. I'm going to throw Chris under the bus. I'm saying that out loud right now. Chris said maybe God just needs to put more hours in the day. I think you're missing the point. You know, some of this, I can't help but think about when the Industrial Revolution started, especially in England. There was a lot of child labor. There was a lot of 7 days a week work that they were in the factories, and the mines were going 7 days a week because the factories were going 7 days a week. And into that very same period of human history, a couple of brothers and some friends decided to talk about Christian principles. And it's funny because when the mines and the factories started taking Methodists and making them their foremans, they would take days off and the factories would produce more. And they would become better work environments, and they'd have happier employees and less injuries on the job. And, but this has nothing at all to do with how we get things done. There's no point in human history where we've ever given this experiment a try and found that it works. Sorry, we'll move on. Side effect, notice France went through the same thing, and because of how their employees were treated, they don't have a monarchy anymore. Have you noticed that about France? Notice who still has a monarchy and managed to go through the Industrial Revolution and came out better? Just saying. So maybe Christian principles have a place. Possibly. We don't need more hours, Chris. We just need.
Another day.
We do. It's called Monday after Sunday. And once every 4 years, you get an extra day.
And every 6 months, you either get less hour or gain an hour.
Or next hour.
Actually, I think we've gotten rid of that now.
Probably the ones who do it.
You know, but on a serious note, how many of us would have just read over this and moved on and not really given it a whole? Verse 13, God starts. Pay attention to all I have said to you. Just dot, 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 right there, right? We can just stop with that phrase. And make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. Why would he be talking about other gods in the midst of all these principles?
A lot of cultures had a lot of so-called gods.
So we're in this question 4, right?
Today, some of those gods are called money.
Some of them. Oh, I'm in for a penny and for a pound, right?
Yeah.
The gods haven't left. The other gods of this world, they haven't left. They put on a new mask. Yeah, why not? We're just gonna jump into a hole. Part of the reason God has inserted this here, because understand, the other religions of the world, the other gods, did not talk about taking a day off. The only reason to take off was to come beseech the gods and get their favor. And then you go back to what you're doing otherwise. A couple of years ago, I was in a seminar. It was new room, and I was with an Old Testament professor. And she was talking about how in Jerusalem, okay, in Jerusalem, within the temple complex, are you getting the context so far? They found a cache of over 3,000 infant skulls and bodies, where the people of Jerusalem, the Israelite people, the God-fearing people, had been practicing infant sacrifice.
It could be just death as an infant, which would probably be more prevalent then.
Not when they find cut marks on the bones. That's just it. This wasn't the plague. This wasn't some disease. This was a willful choice by the people of God living in the city of God with the temple of God. And all throughout the rest of this Old Testament, we're going to hear about worship of Molech. And one of the primary ways to gain Molech's favor was to sacrifice a child for the blessing of strength and prosperity. And where I'm going to move into meddling is I'm just going to say this statement and then I'm going to let it drop. I'm going to walk over here. But anybody know of a place where we sacrifice children for the sake of comfort and safety, so we're not bearing any responsibility? Do I need to connect the dots?
Are you talking about abortion?
I didn't say it.
I did.
The notion of sacrificing children for a blessing hasn't changed. It's just wearing a new mask. Fair enough? Can I step away from that?
Good point.
God is being very clear. If you worship any of these other gods, their ways are going to creep into your life.
Didn't the people do that, just kind of cover their bases, just not really 100% sure?
But we would never do that, would we? We would never hedge our bets because we just don't trust God enough to follow his ways. God's saying, don't even mention these other gods, because if you mention them, you'll get curious. And if you get curious, you'll start to follow. And if you follow, you'll start to practice. And if you practice, you won't do things my way. And if you don't do things my way, guess where that ends you up? But it could be the God of money. It can be the God of power. It can be the God of prestige. There's all kinds of things that we worship. The God of entertainment, we've kind of hinted at that one a little bit, right? Okay. Cover that over, sweep it under the rug. 14. 3 times in a year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. As I commanded you, you shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time of the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of harvest, of the first fruits of your labor, of what you sow in the field. And you shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field of the fruit of your labor. 3 times in the year you shall all your males appear before the Lord God. So what do you think? What do you notice?
What does he mean by he men should appear before the Lord God?
3 times a year, there was a week-long feast that everyone was meant to gather together and go to the tabernacle. Gather together for a 7-day-long feast of worship. Go away from home. You get 3 weeks of vacation where you gather together and it's just a week-long party. Every male, not just the privileged ones, not just the wealthy ones, not just the Jews, everybody. Minimum of 3 weeks of vacation, and it's got to be spent partying.
Yes. I hate to leave that subject, but I don't want.
Does that mean I get an extra week vacation this year?
Abib was the name of one of the months. Abib is pretty close to March, April. It kind of straddles the end of March and beginning of April. So you'd have one feast in the spring. You have one feast at the beginning of summer, and you have one feast in fall. For the record, the fall feast that happens to be what, since I've been here, we've done our church camp out around that, just for the record.
Well, we do this with Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter. Feast.
Okay, it says, if we are still to observe the Sabbath, as in verse 12, are we still to observe the festivals in these verses also? What do you think?
I get kind of along that line. My thought was, mine says men and often accompanied by families. So I'm thinking, when are they resting and who's making all the food?
There's a difference between a Sabbath and a festival. In a festival, everyone worked together for the feast. You could cook, you could do the preparation. So that,
Like a carry.
it's like a carry, yes. A Sabbath, everyone completely rests. A feast, everyone participates. So last year, whenever we did our cookout, we did it around the Feast of Tabernacles, which is also the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the season. And in that season, often the women might do the cooking, but the men were responsible to go gather the resources to build their booths, to build their tents. And they had to find hyssop and willow and lemon and I can't remember what the fourth one was. But they had to create these beautiful booths that you participated in, that we gathered together to have the festivities. And so half the group does the decorating and the other half does the cooking, and together we feast and we celebrate. So yeah, in these feasts, the whole family went and participated.
But not on the Sabbath.
Usually these feasts started with the Sabbath and ended with the Sabbath. So it was a period in between two Sabbaths. Okay, my personal feeling is, if you read the Gospels, especially the Gospel of John, you see Jesus very clearly living into all these feasts and festivals. And yeah, Jim, on a technicality, we do Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter,
But not probably.
but not for a whole week. And all three of them kind of center around us thanking God and worship, but not quite. Would you agree?
Bunnies, football, and Santa.
Bunnies, football, and Santa, yeah. Think of how much different it might be if just we took those three. Let's say that those are our three, right? And we make each of them a week where you have to take the whole week off. Now, yeah, technically, I guess Christmas, it's a week from Christmas until New Year's, right? Like a lot of people take that whole week off. A lot of businesses close for the whole week. But imagine if Thanksgiving was a whole week.
A lot of turkey.
That's a lot. Hey, people who are short on sleep would have it made up after a week of tryptophan, right?
Sure, people walk those
But notice, these three festivals, our festivals are in the shorter days of the year, are they not? These three festivals are in the longer days, where you normally would spend more time working, right? We got one in the spring, one in the middle of summer, and one in the fall. God's saying, yes, you need to take 3 weeks, but I'm not going to make you take the 3 weeks where you're the least productive. I'm saying take 3 weeks where you're more productive.
I know it was a different time, so what's like the rationality that's behind that?
I think it's a beginning, that principle. You are not tied to what you produce. It's not about what you do. Understand, if you give me the best of your time, the most productive of your time, your first fruits, I will provide the difference.
There's also a gathering of people, getting along, the
Yeah.
fellowship.
It's about fellowship. It's about the people gathering and understanding that corporately, it's not just that I individually am not tied to what I do. I individually am not tied to what my bank account is. We as a people are defined by our communal relationship to each other and our communal relationship to God.
Sounds like a Sunday carry in at a Methodist church.
But a week long. Yep, Amy, for a whole week. Would that change anything?
I'm just thinking how a lot of people can't get an hour.
Oh, yeah, there's that, isn't it? They can't give an hour a week, so that it's hard to give a day a week, and they can't give a day a week, so how could they give a week a season? But God said he'd take care of the rest, so do we really trust him?
A lot of people who can't give the time is because they're doing a pleasure thing, playing golf or whatever. They can't go to church Sunday because they got a golf meeting 50 miles away. No.
He says golf is not pleasure.
Not the way I play. Yeah.
You know, your kids have football or baseball on Sunday morning.
I mean, I know our kids were in sports and in different things like that. They, our kids were not. If they wanted to host one on Sunday morning, our kids was not going to be there.
They're standing up for your principal, don't you?
Yeah.
So we're in the law, right? Last week I started doing this. It goes against how I normally want to handle it, but I want to show how these connect. If you've got a Bible that you can find, books real quick, turn with me to Malachi chapter 3. And I'm going, just let you know, I'm going to be reading verses 6 through 12. If not, if you can't turn to it fast, just listen. Malachi chapter 3, verses 6 through 12. For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed. From the days of your fathers you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you say, how shall we return? Will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? In tithes and contributions. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of the hosts. If I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need, I will rebuke the devourer for you, so that it will not destroy the fruits of your soil, and your vine in the field shall not fail to bear, says the Lord of hosts. Then all the nations will call you blessed, for you will be in a land of delight, says the Lord of hosts. What do you think? You think they remembered to live into this? God says test it. You can't give that hour a week? Test it. Just see how it changes. You can't afford to give an offering? Try one. Just see. Just say, I'll do it for a month. Let's see how it works. I'll give the 1 hour a week to go to church for a month. We'll see what changes. I'll take a whole Sabbath day once a week for a season. Try it for a month. Try it for a season, 3 months. See what happens. God literally says, when it comes to my rules, put me to the test. See what happens when you follow my rules. And when you follow them, I'll open the windows of heaven and the world will look at you and they'll say, you are blessed. What do you think about that? What you got, Charles?
I was also thinking, he also said the whole time. It's like, if you know math, you can't have a part of a tenth. You either have a tenth or you don't. And so there are some people who say, I tried it But have they really tried it God's way? Or they said, tried something close, not quite.
In this passage, Malachi, God is speaking through the prophet Malachi, and he's saying, you say you have all these poor people, you say you have all this need, but you're not doing this principle that I gave you. The tithe was meant to care for the priests, the widows, the orphans, the people who aren't able to get out into the field and work. He's saying, test me on it and see if you all do your part, trust me, I'll do my part. And while that's referring specifically to the tithe, he also says, if you follow my principles, coming back to say, taking 3 weeks of feasting and festivals. Okay, you ask the question, do we have to follow this? No, we don't have to. But if we don't do what God says, can we expect to get the fullness of the blessings that he says? Just say. Jesus says very clearly, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, to show the fullness of the law, to show what the law was meant to do for you. Right? When the little boy brings his lunch, 2 fish, 5 loaves. I did a sermon in Tell City, and Charles and I talked at length about this. 2 small fish and 5 tortillas.
Not burrito size.
Not burrito size, the little street taco size. 5 tortillas and two fish fiddlers. Jesus took and fed the entire North Adams School Corporation and everyone that lives in it. Every man, woman, child fed with 2 fish and 5 street tacos, and they picked up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Because one kid said, Jesus, I don't have a lot, but what I got, you can have. It says it fed 5,000 men, plus women and children. If you estimate out, it could easily have been over 15,000 people. Easily. With 2 catfish fiddlers and 5 taco shells. Malachi says, put me to the test. You think these principles are hard? Give them a shot and see what they bring. Like you said, there's people who say, I just don't have time to give that hour on Sunday for church. Man, I can't afford to let my fields go fallow in the 7th year because we just are barely getting by. I can't afford to take 3 weeks off a year because there's just too much work to be done.
But isn't that 3 weeks spread out, 1 week, 1 week, 1 week?
Yeah.
And isn't that like taking today a vacation week every so often?
But don't we typically take our vacations for ourselves?
It helps rejuvenate the body.
But this is saying, what if we took our vacations for the body? We gathered around with those who believe like we do and just celebrate God's goodness. A week of worship, food and games and fellowship and sleep and not work. Probably some of the best moments I've had in the last 19 years of pastoral ministry were for 2 years when we lived in Oakland City. Every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we would open up our house, and anywhere from, on a low day, 8 people, on a high day, 22 kids, most all college kids, would come in to our house and help us cook lunch, and we would, at the dining room table, they'd be sitting down talking about what they were learning in school, and there were deep theological discussions. In the kitchen, while we were cooking, they were talking about what was on TV and what was going on in the world. And And we were talking about how our faith interacts with that while we were preparing the food. And in the living room, they were playing the GameCube, and a couple of guys would bring their guitars and they'd be singing worship music. And so you had worship and play in the living room, and you'd have deep theological discussions in the dining room, and we would be talking about how faith interacted in the world, in the kitchen. And then when the food was done, everybody would eat. And I've never in my life experienced church like that. But man, those are some of the best experiences I've ever had. And I have to imagine that that's what these festivals were like. The body gathering together, talking about what was going on in their lives, and talking about what was going on in the world, and they were working together, that everyone would be fed, and they were worshiping God, and they were having fun and playing together. But we can't do that today.
You know, when I was in college, Ohio Northern is technically a Methodist school, but you don't sign of that influence. But at that time, chapel was required every Thursday morning. But once a year, they had what they call Religion and Life Week. That week we had chapel every day. And they had different speakers come in. And then the speakers would meet with the students in for an evening meal wherever they ate, the cafeteria or the fraternity houses or whatever. So you'd sit around and do exactly what you talked about. Talk about the theological, anything like that. And that was one of the best weeks on campus.
The interesting thing about these feasts is even when we get into the book of Leviticus and we read about it, essentially, this is not meant to be worked. I mean, yeah, there's an aspect of work to it. When you're preparing food for a bunch of people, there's work to that. And yet I can't help but think about Larry and Gary about being in the kitchen over here. And yeah, we're working when we were preparing food, but it was fun, right? There's something about doing it together that makes it not so much like work. But no, we don't need to worry about these 3 feasts. They're not important. God doesn't provide a harvest. We get a paycheck, right? Moving on. 18. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain until the morning. Any thoughts? Kind of feels out of place, doesn't it?
It's just about not being wasteful.
Some of it's about not being wasteful. That could be a principle, yeah. What do we know about blood?
Carries diseases.
Carries diseases. A lot of the diseases that pass from person to person, animal to person, animal to animal, all come from blood-borne pathogens, right? So do you think God might be doing something by saying, don't eat meat with the blood in it? Just maybe. But there's no science in here either. Just saying.
So it says, don't be offered with leavened bread. Does that mean it's okay with unleavened bread?
So, how many of you are here for Monday, Thursday? I think most of you guys were. We had the unleavened bread. Does unleavened bread soak up much? No. Does leavened bread soak up? What happens if you have a yeast roll sitting on a plate with a bloody stick? And if God is saying, don't eat the blood, And we haven't got there yet, but he says, if you follow my commandments, you'll have no disease, your women won't miscarry, and I promise you that your goods will last you all the way until you get to the promised land where you can get more. What do we know about eating a lot of fat?
A lot of theories about that, and they contradict each other.
There are a lot of theories that do contradict each other, except for we do know there's this whole thing about calories in versus calories spent, and if you eat more calories than you spend, then your body likes to store it. But, and there's no repercussions whatsoever for being overweight, right? That doesn't affect you at all. I think in some ways, when we get into the dietary laws, the food laws, what become known as kosher laws, if you do a little bit of scientific research, you will find that God is saying, if you follow these rules, I will keep you healthy. I'm going to keep you away from the things that might make you sick. I am eternally grateful for the book of Acts and that I can eat my bacon. But I also know what pigs are, and I know if you don't get that cooked right, you are absolutely going to get sick. So here we have a passage directly following a passage about a week-long feast. And just because you're gathering together to party, don't forget to follow my food rules, because I don't want it to turn into a whole party where everybody gets sick from food poisoning. Because that kind of defeats the purpose. That's the Pastor Sam paraphrase translation.
So are they saying that the fat of the festival should be cleaned up and tossed out to the wild animals, or what are they saying?
All of the fat was meant to be burned on the altar. Part of that is it means you don't have to have as much wood. And if you don't have to have as much wood because you got fat burning, guess who doesn't have to go chop wood? Just saying. Any other thoughts? Oh, we get to the fun one. 19. We're going to read 19a. We'll get to 19b here in a second. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. We're stop. What do you think of that one?
Kind of like a tithe, isn't it?
It's the tithe principle, yeah. God's saying, if you trust me enough to give me your best, I'll provide everything else you need. Yeah.
So what happens to those when they are brought in and donated?
The tithe was meant to provide for the priests who were not allowed to own land and not allowed to work in the fields. And the priests were responsible for taking care of all the widows and the orphan and the people who didn't have the ability to provide for themselves. So the tithe was meant to care for those who couldn't care for themselves. The ones who didn't have the physical ability to become servants for the 6 years, God provided a whole society to make sure that everyone was cared for. So that's why Malachi says, bring in the whole tithe and test me on this. And I promise you, if you do it, I'll make sure there's no more need left in the land. Everyone will be provided. But when they wail, God, why do you allow all these poor here? Why won't you do something? He said, I gave you a system. I told you how to care for it. Just do it. Any other thoughts? You got 12 minutes. Ready to go with the fun part? You should not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Here. This passage here, pragmatically, it's the reason why you can't get a cheeseburger in the Holy Land. Is that what it's really talking about? Doesn't that kind of feel too easy compared to everything else we've already been digging into?
Is that their custom already?
Oh, it's absolutely kosher custom now, but no, that was not the custom in going to 4. No, there's no custom about that. You might know something about cooking things in milk. Know what it does?
Clappers.
Well, the milk does clabber, but what does the milk do to the meat?
Isn't it tenderizer?
Somewhat. Milk is really good at covering up spoiled meat. So if you've got an animal that's a little on the sickly side, you could go ahead and butcher it and cook it in milk, and nobody would know the difference.
That's why they invented A1 sauce years ago.
The A1 sauce was for the less desirable cut of meat. It wasn't for rancid meat. There was this principle, especially within the world of that day, that if you were going to a carry-in, a potluck, a festival, and you didn't particularly care for the people that you were going to celebrate with, you could take your less desirable stuff and dress it up a little bit and go ahead and feed it to them. And then later on, whenever they got sick, oh, well, man, someone must have just brought something back. But whose is it? Well, if it was cooked in meat, you wouldn't be, or if it was cooked in milk, you wouldn't be able to tell. Yes, sir.
Also think there's a level of cruelty here. The fact that you take the milk that the mother supplied for the young and cook it in it. There's just something sinister, yeah.
There's
about
something
that.
a little sinister to it, but it's, in some ways, it was actually not just a sinister to the animals, but a sinisterness to the rest of the body. Same principle, 2 weeks ago, whenever I was on vacation, Charles, you and I talked about this last week about how you brought the box of generic cereal and said, don't give something to the food pantry that you wouldn't eat yourself. By the same token, don't give to the food pantry everything that's expired that you haven't eaten. That's this principle. Don't bring the stuff that you wouldn't serve to yourself to the feast where everybody else is going to be eating of it and you might get them all sick. Oh, and don't be cruel to the animals.
Pastor,
Yeah.
I know I've read my Bible many times, and I would have no idea that's what I did.
I had no idea until I had my weekly meeting with Daniel, I'll just be honest, because he said this one bothered him for years. And so he started digging into the culture and they found that it was a pretty common practice for people to feed their enemies meat cooked in milk so that the enemy wouldn't know they were being given food poisoning. Because it
But the same principle applied to this marinating in the milk.
marinating it. Anytime that you're doing something to cover up the fact that it's less than ideal. Remember what we talked about last week with the donkey that was overburdened, right? It didn't matter if it's your enemy's donkey or your neighbor's donkey or your best friend's donkey. Don't abuse people. If you know food is bad, toss it out. You're not going to feed it to your best friend. You're not going to give it to your kids or your grandkids. Don't give it to your enemy.
Wouldn't it be classified as like mass murder if they got food poisoning to the point that they died?
And we've already dealt with a couple weeks back about what happens when you accidentally cause the death of somebody else, right?
It makes me concerned about a meal I had once Sarah got married. down to Texas after she got married here for another reception. And her brother-in-law had us come out and had a big meal, and he marinated a rattlesnake in milk, and then he cooked it and walked.
Well, I don't think that that's the principle, but if you guys know where this comes from, right? You know why culturally we shake hands, don't you?
You wipe your butt with the other.
That's part of it. That's why you use your right hand to shake hands. Why do we extend the hand as a greeting? No weapon. We extend the hand as a greeting to say, I bring you no harm. I have no weapon. I'm not here to attack you. We've lost the notion that we would even come to attack, but we understand this is a greeting of peace and fellowship, right? So if you know that cooking meat in milk is something to disguise something that's bad, then as a general rule, God's saying, if you don't cook any meat in milk, then you never have to worry about the person who's hiding something. Because again, his rules about if you follow these rules, you're not going to get sick, you won't miscarry, and your stuff won't wear out.
So the same thing apply when you do your cheeseburger, cheese on top of your hamburger? That disguise the.
As my wife likes to say, a burger with all kinds of gunk on it means you don't have to taste the burger. Right there?
Protein condiment.
The protein becomes a condiment for everything else. There is a principle in which I don't think there's anything wrong with cooking meat in milk. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a cheeseburger. In some ways, yes, if you cook a baby animal in its mother's milk, that's a little cruel, but the notion of cooking meat in milk there's nothing wrong with it unless you're doing so to cover up something that's more sinister. And there's nothing like taking out your enemy at a party, right? There's never been any kind of Hollywood film or movie that talked about a wedding or a funeral or something else where they come in and they take out the enemy all at once through the food or the party. That doesn't ever happen, does it? I think that this one, while on the one hand you could talk about the cruelty aspect of it, the other side of it is God is saying, you know what, just always shake hands, and you're going to prove that you're coming with good intentions. If culturally they know that this is a way that enemies have often caused harm to one another, let's just not do that at all. You never say anything like that in school, do you, Rick? You know,
Kind of loving.
just be.
Say that all the time. Just be kind of.
Okay, that might be good at home, but we're not going to do that here because they didn't receive it well. So we're just going to say that's going to be in the no-go zone, right? We have principles like that, don't we? Don't go building a nuclear bomb back here and then say you're not going to use it. God is building a different culture. He's building a culture that says if you follow these rules, you will be cared for. Your less fortunate will be cared for. And the world will look at you and say you are blessed, and they will want to be a part of you.
You just must be so disappointed that it never happened yet. Very patient.
Yeah. I think of that passage in the Gospels where Jesus is looking out over Jerusalem and it says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets, how I've longed to gather you together like a hen gathers its chicks under its wing. I want so much more for you. Could you just give me a try?" And yet, for as disappointed as we know God has to be, for as disappointed as he just has to be, he still keeps giving us another chance. for the sake of one. I'll leave the 99 for the sake of the one. If there were 5 righteous in the city of thousands, I'll not destroy it. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, but be a leaven within society. Be salt and light.
Be better.
Be better. Lord, how is this different? Don't be like them. You already know they're bad. You see they're evil, so why in the world would you want to emulate that? Be better. As my friend who wrote a book, the title of the book was Love God, Love People, Don't Do Dumb Crap. Kind of
Well, in a nutshell.
I'm not supposed to cook anymore.
If you can't cook without food poisoning coming around, then yeah, you're not allowed to cook. You're on the decoration crew, not the cooking crew.
It goes like gravy, all day, deal.
I don't know if we turned the page or not.
You didn't mind.
You did in yours, huh? We got through a whole section in mine. But the other side of that is, I'm just going to say this as a final note. If we gathered together for a whole week, 3 times a year, and when we got tired of playing ball and doing the activities, and when we were done with the trip to Pancoma, and did we gather together to talk about faith and life? Could you imagine? Maybe they didn't do weekly Bible studies, but they had week-long Bible studies 3 times a year. Could be a little different, couldn't it? I hope on the one hand, while we feel that sadness, there has to be a little bit of disappointment from God. I hope you're also beginning to get a hope for what God wants for us. And imagine what it might be like on the other side when Revelation finally comes true, and this is true of all the world. There's hope. We should spread that hope.
I just posted this week, posted for hold on payments. What a glorious day that will be.
Glorious day. God, you want us to know your love. You want us to experience your blessings. You want us to enjoy your presence and feast and celebrate your goodness. And Lord, you give us rhythms where once a week we get to experience that celebration in a microcosm that you call the Sabbath. Lord, I pray that we might open our hearts to test you, to try you out, and see if we just might like it. And Lord, as we experience your goodness, may we give that gift to the world around us that so needs something different. May you be glorified in all that we say and do with this information. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Blessings to you all. We'll meet back in 2 weeks and we'll pick up at verse 20. We made it through a whole 10 verses this week.
When he edits out.
We are, as soon as Melissa gets off the